I trusted my accountant with our money. That's how I learned he had access to my marriage. The first thing that changed wasn't my wife's behavior. It wasn't distance or secrecy or a sudden coldness I could point to and name. It was a line item on an invoice that never appeared. I noticed it in the most boring way possible. Reviewing our quarterly statements late one night, half asleep, highlighter in hand. Numbers blurred together the way they always did after a certain hour. But something felt off. A session had been logged. Notes had been updated. Time had clearly been spent. The charge wasn't there. At first, I assumed it was a mistake. Accountants make clerical errors like anyone else. I made a note to flag it, then forgot about it entirely. Free time from a professional felt like a gift. You don't interrogate gifts. When I mentioned it to my wife the next day, she smiled. "Oh, Mark said not to worry about it," she said casually, like she was talking about a waived parking ticket. "He said it wasn't worth billing." That stopped me for half a second. Mark had always been meticulous. Every phone call logged, every email accounted for. He billed in 15-minute increments like time itself was inventory. That precision was why I trusted him. That discipline was the product. "Did he say why?" I asked. She shrugged. "He said we've been good clients, loyal, that it evens out." Evening out wasn't how accounting worked. But I nodded anyway, because it felt petty to question generosity. That was the first compromise I didn't notice myself making. After that, it happened again. And again. Small consultations that never appeared on invoices. Late calls that disappeared into silence. My wife began talking about finances with a fluency she'd never had before, using his phrases, his framing, his calm reassurances. She stopped asking me questions. Instead, she told me answers. "Mark thinks we should restructure this. Mark says this is the safer option. Mark already ran the numbers." Already. There was a subtle shift in our conversations, one I couldn't quite articulate at first. It felt like joining a discussion that had already started without me. Decisions came pre-digested. Concerns had been addressed elsewhere. When I asked follow-ups, she'd smile patiently, like I was catching up to something obvious. "You always overthink this stuff," she'd say. He explained it really clearly. I didn't like the word he replacing we. But again, I let it go. The meetings changed too. When we first hired Mark, we sat side by side across from his desk, equal participants in our own financial life. Now, my wife preferred to meet him alone, to save time. She'd say I didn't need to take off work, that she'd summarize everything afterward, and she did. Thoroughly, confidently, too confidently. One evening I came home early and found her on the phone in the guest room, door half closed. Her voice was low, controlled, not secretive in the obvious way, just careful, the kind of tone you use when you're choosing words deliberately. "I know," she said softly. "I just don't want him worrying about it yet." I stopped in the hallway, heart picking up speed without my permission. A pause. "Yes," she continued. "That makes sense. We just have to be careful." Careful. The word threaded itself through me like a splinter. I stood there long enough to hear her laugh quietly. Nothing flirtatious, nothing dramatic. Familiar, comfortable. When she came out and saw me, she didn't jump. That's what made it worse. She didn't look caught. She looked normal. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Yeah," she said. "Just Mark. We were clarifying a few things." Clarifying. That night after she fell asleep, I did something I'd never done before in our marriage. I opened her laptop, not to search messages, not to dig through photos. I wasn't ready for that kind of proof. I was still looking for reassurance, for something that would tell me I was misreading everything. I searched our shared financial folder. Most of it was exactly what it should be. Statements, reports, projections. Then I found a document I didn't recognize. Recently edited. Mark's name attached as collaborator. I opened it. At first, it looked like planning notes. Bullet points about assets, contingencies, future considerations. Then I saw the comments in the margins. Not about money, about stress, about timing, about not overwhelming him. Her words, his replies, her. Thank you for walking me through that. I felt a lot calmer afterward. Him, that's what I'm here for. You don't have to handle it alone. Her, I just don't want him to see this part yet. Him, understood. We'll be careful. This could get complicated. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't an emotional moment that went too far. This was coordination, strategy. A private lane carved through our life where decisions were being shaped without me. And suddenly, the free time made sense. He wasn't billing because he wasn't just an accountant anymore. He was an ally. I closed the laptop quietly and sat on the edge of the bed, listening to my wife's steady breathing. The room felt unfamiliar, like a hotel I'd stayed in too many times to feel at home. I understood then why this betrayal felt different from every story I'd ever heard. It wasn't passion. It wasn't impulse. It was access. He knew our income, our debts, our vulnerabilities. He knew where pressure lived in our marriage because my wife had handed it to him in neat, organized pieces. And he'd used that knowledge to step into a role I didn't know was vacant until it was filled. The realization didn't make me angry. It made me precise. Because once you understand that someone has been managing your life from behind a spreadsheet, you stop reacting emotionally. You start auditing everything. And I knew, sitting there in the dark, that this wasn't just about infidelity. It was about control. And whoever had it at the moment wasn't me. I didn't find out all at once. That's not how it happened. Damage like this arrives in pieces, spaced out just enough to keep you doubting your own reactions. The first call came from the bank on a Monday morning while I was pouring coffee. The number was unfamiliar, but the tone wasn't. Polite, measured. The kind of voice trained to deliver concern without blame. "Mr. Harris," the woman said, "we're calling to follow up on your exposure." I laughed softly because I thought she had the wrong person. My what? There was a pause, brief, professional. "Your outstanding obligation. We sent notice last week." I told her she must be mistaken. I told her I didn't have any outstanding obligations beyond our mortgage and a modest line of credit we barely touched. I told her my accountant handled all of that and that there must be a clerical error. She didn't argue. She didn't reassure me either. "I understand," she said. "But according to our records, you're personally liable." Personally liable. Those words settled in my chest like cold metal. I asked for details. She said she'd email documentation. I hung up and stared at the coffee mug in my hand until it went cold. The email arrived seconds later. Loan agreements, guarantees, amendments, all bearing my name. A total I couldn't process at first because my brain refused to believe it belonged to me. $1 million. I sat down hard at the kitchen table, documents blurring as my heart began to pound. This wasn't debt in the abstract. This was a number with weight. A number that didn't care about explanations or intentions. I scrolled. There it was. A personal guarantee tied to a restructuring Mark had optimized months earlier. A contingency clause triggered by a market shift I hadn't even noticed. A risk transferred quietly, legally, efficiently. All of it signed. My signature. At least, something that looked like it. I called Mark immediately. Straight to voicemail. I called again, then again. No answer. I left a message that started calm and ended tight, my voice sounding foreign in my own ears. "Call me back, now." When Jenna came home that evening, I was still at the table, papers spread out like a crime scene. She froze when she saw them. "What's this?" she asked. I slid the bank's email toward her. She read silently, her face draining of color with each line. When she reached the total, her hand trembled. "That can't be right," she whispered. "It is," I said. "I owe the bank $1 million. She looked at me, eyes wide, searching my face for the version of me that would tell her this was a misunderstanding, that it would go away if we called the right person. "You signed something," she said finally. Didn't you? No, I said. I didn't. She hesitated. That hesitation was everything. Mark said, she began, then stopped. Mark said what? I asked. She swallowed. He said it was routine, that it was a technical formality. He said you'd already approved the strategy. The room went very quiet. He said, I repeated slowly, that I approved taking on personal liability for $1 million. He said it was temporary, she rushed, that it was leverage, that it would never actually activate. I stood up so fast the chair scraped loudly against the floor. He said, I continued, my voice rising despite my effort to control it, that I wouldn't even notice. Tears welled in her eyes. I thought he was helping us. No, I said. He was helping himself. The pieces snapped together with sickening clarity. The free consultations, the private planning, the comments about timing, the insistence on keeping me from worrying. This wasn't a mistake. It was a calculated shift of risk, one he knew I'd never agree to if I were fully informed. And he'd done it with access only my wife had given him. The bank confirmed it the next day. Calmly, clinically. The obligation was valid. The documents were executed. The exposure was mine. Can we contest it? I asked. Yes, the representative said. But it will take time, and in the meantime, the balance exists. Exists. Like a shadow that didn't care whether I acknowledged it or not. I hired an independent forensic accountant that afternoon. Not to fight yet, to understand, to map the damage, to see how a man I trusted with numbers had turned them into a weapon. The answer came back quickly and without drama. He rerouted risk, she said. Incrementally. He positioned you as a backstop without drawing attention to it. It's sophisticated, not illegal on its face, but deeply unethical if you didn't consent. Could he have done this intentionally? I asked. She met my eyes. Yes. I drove home in silence, hands tight on the steering wheel. My life felt suddenly narrow, like every option had walls closer than before. That night, Mark finally called. I was hoping we could talk, he said, voice smooth, unhurried. There's been some confusion. There's no confusion, I replied. You put me on the hook for $1 million. You're focusing on the number, he said gently, not the strategy. You forged my consent, I said. A pause, then quietly, your wife was aware. The words landed like a punch. She trusted me, he continued. She understood the benefits. She wanted to protect the household. Protect. I laughed then, a short, broken sound. By ruining me. By controlling risk, he corrected. Sometimes people need help making difficult decisions. I hung up. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room, documents stacked neatly now, because chaos had given way to something colder. Resolve. This wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was coercion disguised as expertise. Financial harm delivered with a smile and a waiver. By morning, I understood exactly what had happened. Mark hadn't just crossed a line. He'd tried to bury me under numbers he thought I wouldn't understand until it was too late. And my wife, whether she meant to or not, had held the shovel. I didn't sleep the night after Mark told me my wife was aware. Not because I didn't believe him, but because I did. The house felt different once that realization settled in. Smaller, less forgiving. Every surface reminded me of decisions I thought we'd made together but hadn't. I sat at the dining table until dawn, documents stacked neatly. Not because I needed organization, but because chaos had finally stopped being useful. Anger is loud. Planning is quiet. By morning, I understood something Mark didn't expect. He had mistaken my shock for helplessness. The first thing I did was stop calling him. The second thing I did was hire people who had never heard his name. A forensic accounting firm. A litigation attorney who specialized in financial misconduct. A compliance consultant whose entire career revolved around one question. Where did procedure become manipulation? I didn't tell them my story emotionally. I didn't mention betrayal or marriage or late-night calls. I handed them the facts, the filings, the signatures, the timeline. Let professionals do what they do best. The findings came back faster than I expected. He didn't just shift risk, the forensic accountant told me, tapping the report. He concentrated it. You were positioned as the fail-safe without disclosure. That's not standard practice. Is it legal? I asked. She chose her words carefully. It's defensible only if informed consent exists. And based on what you've shown us, it doesn't. The attorney leaned forward. More importantly, he misrepresented authority, multiple times. That was the crack. We traced email metadata, version histories, comment edits, time-stamped changes that showed documents altered after meetings Mark claimed had already occurred. We compared language he used with me versus language he used with my wife. Professional to me, persuasive to her. He hadn't forged signatures. He'd engineered silence. And that, it turned out, mattered. The lawsuit wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no public spectacle. It was clean, clinical, and deeply uncomfortable for someone who relied on discretion to operate. Breach of fiduciary duty, professional negligence, misrepresentation, undisclosed conflict of interest. Each claim backed by documentation Mark himself had created. When he was served, he didn't call me. He called Jenna. I know because she told me that night, voice shaking. He says you're overreacting, she said. He says this will destroy him. I looked at her across the kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd once believed everything was shared, and felt a strange calm. He destroyed himself, I said. I just stopped protecting him. The court proceedings moved slowly at first, then gained momentum the moment discovery opened. Subpoenas don't care about charm. They don't respond to reassurance. They demand records. Mark's records were thorough, too thorough, billing discrepancies, complementary services undocumented, side communications flagged as outside scope. Risk disclosures missing required language. A pattern, not of error, but of confidence that no one would ever question him. He settled with the bank quietly. That part never made headlines. Institutions prefer silence to accountability when both are available. The civil case didn't settle. He fought it. That was his mistake. On the stand, he spoke the way he always had. Measured, reasonable, calm. He explained strategy. He emphasized complexity. He suggested I simply didn't understand the sophistication of the financial environment. Then my attorney introduced the emails. Not the dramatic ones, the subtle ones. The don't worry about billing. The he doesn't need to know yet. The we'll time this carefully. Timing, careful. The same words that had haunted me months earlier now sat in a courtroom transcript, stripped of context and exposed to scrutiny. The judge didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. I find, he said, that the defendant acted with willful disregard for informed consent. Just like that, the narrative shifted. Mark didn't lose everything in a single moment. That would have been cinematic. He lost it in increments. Clients withdrew quietly. Professional boards took interest. Referrals dried up. People don't like uncertainty attached to their finances. The ruling came down on a Tuesday. Damages awarded. Personal liability established. Professional misconduct confirmed. I didn't feel victorious. I felt complete. Outside the courthouse, Mark didn't look at me. He didn't apologize. He didn't argue. He looked smaller. Jenna stood beside me, not touching, not asking for forgiveness, just present in the wreckage of choices she hadn't believed would ever come due. I didn't think he'd go that far, she said. I nodded. Neither did I. But I understood something now that neither of them had. Access is power, and once you revoke it, people who rely on it collapse under their own weight. I hadn't framed Mark. I hadn't needed to. I let him explain himself, and that was enough. The divorce didn't begin with a fight. It began with paperwork. I learned quickly that endings aren't loud when they're inevitable. They're administrative. They arrive in envelopes and calendars and meetings where everyone speaks carefully because the outcome has already chosen its direction. I filed first. Not out of spite, but because timing matters when truth finally has a paper trail. My attorney didn't dramatize it. She laid out options, risks, and the simple fact that the financial harm Mark had engineered and Jenna had enabled changed everything about how assets would be evaluated. Consent mattered, knowledge mattered, cooperation mattered. Jenna had none of those on her side. The discovery process was brutal in the way only facts can be. Bank statements, message logs, calendar entries, side agreements that had never been disclosed, helpful decisions made on my behalf without my authorization. Each document wasn't damning on its own. Together they told a story that didn't require embellishment. My wife hadn't just betrayed me emotionally. She'd participated. She'd shared private financial access. She'd coordinated strategy. She'd accepted risk transfers she didn't understand but benefited from in the short term. The court didn't care whether she believed Mark's reassurances. It cared whether she had the authority to give them. She didn't. The hearing itself was quiet. No raised voices. No dramatic testimony. Jenna sat across from me looking smaller than I remembered. Hands folded tightly in her lap like she was trying to hold herself together through force alone. Her lawyer spoke about stress, about manipulation, about trust placed in a professional, about how people make mistakes when they feel overwhelmed. My attorney responded with records, dates, numbers, signed acknowledgments, evidence that Jenna had acted independently, repeatedly, and knowingly, excluded me from decisions that exposed me to catastrophic loss. When the judge spoke, he didn't sound angry. He sounded resolved. He acknowledged the emotional collapse of the marriage, then returned, again and again, to the financial reality. He stated plainly that the losses incurred were not mutual, that the benefits had not been mutual, that the concealment had been deliberate. Property division followed the damage, not as punishment, as consequence. The house went to me, not because I asked for it, but because it had been leveraged without my knowledge to secure obligations I never approved. The accounts reverted to my control. Investments were reassigned. Personal assets transferred. Jenna's counsel objected weakly. Equity, fairness, years of marriage. The judge listened, then shook his head. Equity requires good faith, he said. This court does not find it here. When it was over, Jenna had nothing left to divide. No property, no accounts, no claim. She stared at the ruling as if it were written in another language. I didn't feel satisfaction watching her read it. I felt distance, like I was observing a moment that belonged to someone I used to know. Outside the courtroom, she finally spoke. "You took everything," she said quietly. I met her eyes. "No, you spent it." She flinched, not because the words were cruel, but because they were accurate. We didn't argue. There was nothing left to negotiate. She signed what needed to be signed with a hand that trembled only once, then steadied. That steadiness surprised me. Maybe it surprised her too. She moved out within a week. I stayed behind, packing her things into boxes with a care that had nothing to do with affection. Just closure. Objects are easier to handle than memories. Each empty drawer made the house feel larger, quieter, less crowded by things that didn't belong anymore. Friends asked careful questions. I gave careful answers. There were no sides taken loudly, just a gradual reshaping of social gravity. Invitations shifted. Names stopped appearing together. Jenna disappeared from my daily life in increments so small they barely registered until one morning I realized I hadn't thought about her at all. That was when I knew it was done. The accountant's case continued in parallel, moving toward its own conclusion. I didn't follow every update. I didn't need to. His presence no longer dictated anything about my future. The final decree arrived on a Thursday afternoon. I signed it at the same table where I'd once reviewed spreadsheets and trusted people who were quietly emptying the room behind me. When I stood up afterward, the house didn't feel hollow. It felt clean. Jenna never asked me for help, never appealed, never blamed me publicly. In a strange way, that restraint was the last honest thing she did. She lived with the outcome she helped create. So did I. Only one of us walked away with the foundation intact. And for the first time since the first invoice went missing, I understood something simple and absolute. Loss doesn't always come from taking too much. Sometimes it comes from giving access where there should have been boundaries. Everyone thought the story was over once the court stamped the final decree. Friends, colleagues, even my own lawyer assumed this was the ending. The part where the man who was wronged finally stands alone amid the wreckage, victorious, justified, hardened. That I would sell the house, disappear, rebuild quietly, and let the people who betrayed me live with the consequences they'd earned. That's what everyone expected. That's why no one saw what came next. It happened months later, on a Tuesday afternoon so ordinary it felt insulting. I was cleaning out a box of old files, documents I no longer needed but hadn't yet been able to throw away, when I found something I'd overlooked before. A handwritten note. It was folded inside an early financial worksheet Mark had prepared years ago, back when he was just an accountant and not a weapon. The paper had yellowed slightly. The ink was neat, deliberate. "If anything ever happens to me," it read, "this is where everything is. I trust you." The note wasn't signed, but I knew the handwriting. It was my father's. My chest tightened in a way I hadn't felt since the divorce. Not sharp pain, but pressure, memory, context snapping into place where it hadn't existed before. I sat down and reread the note, then flipped through the attached documents with slower hands. Accounts I'd forgotten, a dormant trust, instructions written years before my marriage, before Jenna, before Mark ever entered our lives. Safeguards my father had built quietly, assuming that one day I'd need them, even if I didn't know it yet. The irony was brutal. I hadn't lost everything. I never had. I'd just been made to feel like I had. The money was substantial, enough to change lives, enough to close chapters permanently, enough to punish if punishment was what I wanted. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because I was angry, but because I was confronted with a choice I hadn't anticipated. I could keep everything, lock it away, let the people who betrayed me live exactly as the courts had left them, or I could do something that would make no sense to anyone watching from the outside. A week later, I met Jenna for the first time since the divorce. Not at a lawyer's office, not in a place tied to memory, just a quiet cafe halfway between our new lives. She looked thinner, quieter, older in a way that had nothing to do with time. She assumed I wanted something. "I'm not here to reopen anything," I said before she could speak. "I just need to tell you something." She braced herself. I told her about the trust, about my father's note, about the money that had never been touched, money Mark had never known about, money that had never factored into the lawsuits or the divorce. Her face crumpled, not with greed or relief, but with something closer to regret. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I know," I said, and for the first time, I meant it without bitterness. Then I told her what I'd decided. I was going to give her a portion of it. Not as restitution, not as forgiveness, not because she deserved it, but because I refused to let the worst period of my life dictate the shape of the rest of it. She stared at me like I'd lost my mind. "Why?" she asked. "After everything?" I answered honestly. "Because if I don't, this story ends with me becoming someone I don't recognize." She cried then, not theatrically, not manipulatively, just quietly, like someone who finally understood that consequences and mercy can exist in the same room. I didn't tell her the second part until later, that the money came with boundaries, finality, no future contact, no rewriting of history, no shared narrative about closure, just a clean handoff and a permanent distance. She accepted without argument. The accountant never saw a cent of it. In fact, the most unexpected part, the part no one ever predicted, was what I did next. I withdrew my remaining claims against him, not because he was innocent, not because he deserved mercy, but because he was already finished. His career was gone, his reputation unrecoverable, his access revoked. Continuing would have been punishment for my sake, not justice. I didn't want to carry him with me anymore. The final shock came quietly. Months later, I ran into Mark by accident at a grocery store. He didn't recognize me at first. Then he did, and froze. I nodded once. No anger, no triumph, just acknowledgement. He looked relieved. That's when I understood how wrong everyone had been about revenge. They thought I'd win by taking everything. I won by choosing what not to keep. Today, my life is smaller, but cleaner. No secrets. No professionals who know more about my future than I do. No shared passwords. No quiet, careful decisions made without consent. People still ask how I survived it, how I moved on. I tell them the truth. I audited my life the way I once audited spreadsheets. I removed what was costing me more than it was worth. And when I finally closed the book on that chapter, it didn't end with punishment or applause. It ended with a decision no one saw coming. I walked away whole, while everyone else stayed trapped inside the consequences they thought they'd escaped.